Welcome everyone to today's presentation on kindness and healthy peer relationships. I am pleased to introduce my colleague, Dr. Michelle Muratori. Michelle?
Okay, well, thank you, Stacy. And I just want to thank everybody for tuning in today. I'm excited to talk about this topic of kindness and healthy peer relationships because, well, in particular, kindness, I think it's often undervalued. And yet it is so incredibly important. I do want to say that the theme of kindness has been something we focused on this month at CTY. And earlier, James Rhee gave a wonderful presentation on kindness, and he relates it to math, and he epitomizes kindness. So you may want to check that one out. And also my colleague, Katie Bowman, wrote a blog post on cultivating kindness both at home and in the classroom. So be sure to look at the resources on our website for that. Okay, and with that, I will tell you a little bit about myself. Okay, all right. Aside from my hair looking a little bit different here, I am CTY's Assistant Director of Student Support, and I'm also an advisor for the CTY Scholars Program at CTY. I have been here for nearly 20 years, and in that time, I have advised many different families. And in providing educational guidance to these students, there are always social, emotional dimensions to the work that I'm doing. I'm always considering that social emotional context in which students are managing their different issues, whether it's like dealing with perfectionism, or we talk about the uneven development where one's maybe abilities are really off the charts while yet the maturity level is not there. So there's a lot really going on with high ability students. And I think we all know that the pandemic has really taken a toll on them in many ways. So I think this topic is really very, very important. I should also add, I do teach in the Masters of Counseling program. I train school counselors and clinical mental health counselors. And so I've also written a few books in the counseling field. And when I think about like the themes that I'm most drawn to, it's things like coping skills, resilience, building on strengths, and self-care. And really all of these things are tools to help people and students navigate through this very stressful world that we are in. I think it's safe to say that we are definitely living in stressful times, not only having dealt with the pandemic, but also like the polarization and the divisiveness in society. Kids are dealing with a lot these days. So I think dealing with kindness is very important. Okay. All right. So let's not think about the bad news. All right. Right now, for the next several minutes, I want you to think about kindness. So think about an act of kindness in which you were either the giver or the receiver. It doesn't have to be anything big. It could be something as simple as letting somebody go in front of you in line because it looks like they're in a hurry. Or it could be giving them a cup of coffee, or helping out a neighbor, doing a chore for them. Not expecting anything in return, just for the pure act of giving. So in your mind's eye, when you have that image or that memory, think about what it was like for you. How did it feel? How did it make you feel? How did it look like it made the other person feel? My guess is that it made you feel pretty good. Much better than if you're focused on the news all the time. And of course, we need to pay attention to some of those things that aren't as pleasant to think about. But I think we need some balance, and to also think about what's good in the world. All right, so the agenda here today, very briefly, I'm going to talk about the benefits and the importance of kindness. I'm also going to talk about relationships in terms of healthy versus unhealthy peer relationships. And by the way, when I'm talking about peers, for you to get the most out of this, I want you to think about your own child and who their important peer relationships are. That could be close friendships. It could be, casual acquaintances or teammates, like on sports teams or in academic clubs. If students are old enough to date, it would also, I think, apply to like dating partners. So just think about that. I'm kind of casting a broad net here as I speak. So then I'm going to move into making this very practical. I want to give you some strategies, first of all, that students can use to maybe improve their peer relationships, and also what you can do. What can adults do to support students in developing positive peer relationships? So as I'm sure you were in touch with, it feels good. It feels good to be kind. And that's not just like a bumper sticker slogan, right? But it really does. And we know there are benefits to kindness, physical benefits. For one thing, it can lower our blood pressure. And it's never good to be in this constant state of being stressed. And so kindness actually helps with that in terms of like lowering cortisol. It also can improve our mood, and those neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine that also play a role in things like depression actually can get boosted through acts of kindness. The other thing is that, as you see on the slide there, it does increase empathy. And sometimes people, they use the word empathy, but they're not always sure exactly what does that mean. Empathy is really the ability to kind of see the world from another person's perspective. It's related kind of to compassion, but it is a little bit different. And one way to look at it would be to like look outside a person's window. Like, what is it that they're seeing from their perspective? It doesn't mean that you get lost in their perspective or that you even agree with their perspective, but it means that you can see and respect, their perspective. All right. There also clearly are interpersonal benefits of being kind. Kindness builds bridges. And rather than like shutting people down, being kind promotes an open dialogue with people. So a lot of high ability students aspire to be in leadership roles and very well may end up in leadership roles. So it is so important for them to be kind and to not make people defensive, So I think there are many reasons to cultivate kindness in your children. I think all of you probably have had the experience of being on the receiving end of that when somebody makes an unkind remark or they're giving you feedback and it's unkind or presented in that way. What happens? Well, usually the walls come up, right? And so all of a sudden, you're not really listening to what the person is saying because you're just trying to defend yourself. And we all have defense mechanisms. They're meant to protect us, right? It's just part of the human experience. We all can have defense mechanisms. So the goal here is to open dialogue, not to close it down. And kindness can do that and can promote cooperation. All right. So kindness matters in so many ways. It matters in all kinds of peer relationships and for students of all ability levels. It reduces loneliness, and it can even boost academic achievement, because if a student feels like they belong and they're in a place where they're supported by their friends and their peers, where it's okay for them to be who they are, then that's going to reflect in their academic achievement. It boosts their self-esteem, and it can also buffer against negativity. Even having one friend can buffer against the negativity of other peers. So it's having the ability to develop positive peer relationships is very important, because students are going to spend a lot of time with peers over the years that they're together in school, and you want to make sure that kind of it gets off to a good start, right? I'm going to talk a little bit about healthy and unhealthy relationships, but I do have this caveat, which is I think that we have to be a little careful when we talk about, what is healthy and unhealthy, because it often is culturally bound. And we have to think about the cultural context. A good example of this is when we talk about boundaries. So for example, in some cultures, what might be considered enmeshed behavior, in another culture would not seem enmeshed at all. That's just like a normal relationship, right? But sometimes that can be pathologized. So it might depend on whether one has been raised in a collectivist culture or an individualistic kind of culture. That the way that we look at boundaries, whether they're too enmeshed or too rigid. So try to be careful with, not rushing to judgment about that. However, I do want to also add that there are some situations where certain boundaries should never be crossed. And that's when we're talking about like human rights abuses or abuse of any kind. That's just not okay. So as you see in this word cloud part, there are all these positive words to describe healthy relationships. So think about your child and think about the peer relationships that they have. Do any of these words describe those relationships? I mean, it's important that in a strong friendship or relationship, that there's really healthy, open communication, that both parties feel respected, that they care about each other, they empower each other, right? You want, friends should validate us. That doesn't mean that they agree with everything that you say or that you agree with everything they say, but there's respect for the other person's position. Friends know that the other person has their best interests in mind. They're not going to tear them down. They're going to be there for them, but yet there still can be boundaries, and boundaries are important. But I think friends can respect other, their friends' boundaries, right? Okay. Now, by contrast, let's talk about unhealthy peer relationships for a few minutes. As depicted in this little image here, you see, it's not, I don't know, the most rewarding when everybody's just pointing their fingers like, oh, it's their fault, and nobody's taking ownership for their feelings or behaviors, right? It's just everybody's just casting blame on everybody else. Now, sometimes in a relationship, there's one person mainly doing that, and somehow it's never their responsibility, no matter what they say, even if it's something that's unkind. It's like, well, I wouldn't have said that if you didn't make me say that, right? So I think if you, in your own life, think about the impact of those words on you, you know that it doesn't feel good. Okay, so I want to say a little bit more about unhealthy peer relationships. We hear the word toxic, right, a lot. It's kind of a buzzword. Things are toxic. Well, there are certain types of relationships that really are toxic. And this applies to all kinds of relationships, but especially, like when you're watching your child and you see them engage in relationships that may not be healthy, here are some things to look out for. Like, is there controlling behavior going on? In that kind of dynamic, one person is calling all the shots. It's like it's their way or the highway, right? And in fact, sometimes a person can become so possessive that, they isolate their friends from others, right? Because it's more possessive. Also, there's hostility that's evident, and that that shouldn't be the case. Your friend should not be harboring this hostility towards you, right? So you should feel safe to be who you are and not worry that you're going to be under attack or criticized. All right. Dishonesty, that's also important. I mean, that's a characteristic. But actually, there are times when a person might say they're being honest, and yet they're delivering their comments in a really brutal way or unkind way. And then they say, well, I was just being honest. One of my counseling mentors made a statement that really has resonated with me, and that is that honesty without caring is cruelty, or it certainly can be. So, that's something to be aware of. Also, you should never feel intimidated. You shouldn't feel like you're constantly being disrespected. And another thing to watch out for is that, like, if your child seems really dependent on that other person and starts to care more about how they're feeling than about their own feelings, right? Okay, and as clearly, violence of any sort is bad news. Okay, so let's just now talk about what are some strategies that students can use in order to develop their, positive, strong relationships and friendships. I would say that it all really starts with self-awareness. Self-awareness is really at the core, because if a person, a student, knows who they are, they know what their feelings are, what they're thinking, then they can also see how they're impacting other people. They can sense how, the impact they're having, and then they can adjust their behavior accordingly. It's hard to be in touch with what other people need if, like, you're really not in tune with yourself. So we want to foster that in students. And one way to do that is for them to be reflective, to reflect on their feelings and their thoughts and their behaviors and the impact that it's having on other people. For students who aren't really aware and don't have a feelings vocabulary, they might use something like a feelings wheel. And there are different tools that students can use to kind of get in touch with their different feelings. So that's number one. Also, obviously being kind to others and expressing gratitude, telling your friends you appreciate them. Doesn't it feel good? It does feel good when somebody expresses gratitude. Another thing I want to make sure we don't forget is to say that students also need to show themselves self-compassion and be kind to themselves. In fact, I know many students who actually, they always leave themselves out of the equation, and they're always giving and giving of themselves. But if you do that, at one point you're going to be pouring from an empty cup, and you're not going to have much to give. So it's important to, for students to be kind to themselves. And also that means drawing some boundaries. So by the way, being kind doesn't mean having no boundaries and just letting, caving into other people. It means, still having clear boundaries, but also maybe setting them in a way that is respectful of others. Okay. The last point I want to make here is how power is distributed. And what I mean by that is, I think all we need to do is look at an unhealthy relationship where somebody's just controlling and has more of the power, right? I think in a healthy relationship, power should be distributed. Power should be distributed equally, right? Nobody's using or misusing power. So just pay attention to that. Okay, here's some very practical strategies that students can use to communicate their needs respectfully. First of all, make I statements. We often will say, you do this, you do that, but rather you could say, if you're trying to deliver feedback to somebody, you might say, you know, when you did this is how it was for me. This is how I'm feeling. And no one can argue with your feelings. They're your feelings, right? You want to avoid criticizing and learn assertion skills. Now, when I say you, I guess I'm meaning to anybody who's listening, because this is all applicable both, you know, to parents and caregivers, to students. If there are educators who are listening, it's important for everybody. I think we remember the goal is we don't want to make people more defensive. We want people to be receptive to what we are saying and to hear. So asking yourself that question, what outcome am I wanting here, is, I think, important. What is it that I'm really wanting out of this? If I want someone to hear what I'm saying, then I need to present it in a way that others will hear. So I need to be respectful in the way I communicate it. I need to make I statements. I need to keep my tone down. If I'm screaming, it's just going to make somebody defensive and not hear me at all. And so it's bad for everybody, right? The other thing I want to say there is about regulating emotions. And actually, we could spend a lot of time talking about emotional regulation. For one thing, students should learn like a feelings vocabulary. And there, like I mentioned, there's like a feelings wheel and different tools they can use for that. But also, I think there are things like practicing mindfulness, or certainly like meditation, finding ways to calm oneself down. But being able to spot when one is getting triggered, and maybe when you need to take a step back, take some deep breaths. There also are other kinds of strategies, like more like cognitive strategies that one might use to kind of reframe the way a person sees a situation so they don't have such a maybe extreme reaction. When I talk about emotions, there are some students who might be externalizers, and they kind of express their emotions, and perhaps that will impact the way that other students interact with them, right? We all have emotions and everybody should feel those emotions, but I think there also are ways where we can manage the emotions so that it doesn't push others away, right? Now, some students might internalize their emotions, and you might not even ever see it, but they take it out in different ways. So you might see students who feel depressed, or they might even, in severe cases, right, or develop eating disorders, or they might internalize their emotions. So I think what we want to do is help students to express their emotions in really appropriate ways, and there are tools for that. Okay, now I would like to, before I talk about what adults can do, I just want to make this point that if a friendship ends up being toxic, then you can choose not to stay in the friendship. And I think it's important that students shouldn't feel like they have to make relationships work at all costs, and that there are trusted adults out there who will be there to support them. And of course, as a counselor, I would always say counseling is a very good a good resource for them. You know, if we don't want students to feel distressed, so make use of mental health resources. And by the way, Stacy will be sending out some resources after the presentation, and I've included some there for you. All right, so what can you do? Well, now you might see that you're already doing some of these things, like scheduling play dates. But also, as kids get older, you might really encourage them to get involved in the school clubs, like the robotics club, the book club, the math team, or sports, because that's a wonderful way around shared interests for students to connect and practice social skills, right? Just like so many things in life, it gets better if with more practice and students start to feel more comfortable interacting. Now, of course, parents and caregivers should regulate peer relationships, because you want to make sure that they're appropriate and healthy. But I would say that over time, that might look a little bit different, right? When kids are young, you know, you're scheduling the play dates and everything, and you have more of an eye on it. But then as students get older, you might be doing it a little bit more from a distance, but you still need to do that. You also want to make sure that you have the kind of relationship where your kids can come to you and they can talk about some of the problems that they're having with peers, right? So while some parents and caregivers might have the tendency to want to just like fix it right away because they don't want to see their child in pain, it might be more helpful for them if you try to help them to problem solve. First of all, you want to listen to them, but you also want to brainstorm and role play with them how they could maybe work through some of these challenging situations. Now, I want to get back to that point about creating the safe space for them. I really want to emphasize the importance of listening. Sometimes we rush in too quickly, and active listening involves really paying attention to their words, but also their behaviors, their nonverbals. And sometimes it goes a long, long way just to have someone listen to you. So that you're helping them a lot, even just by listening. Okay, in some cases, you may want to coach your kids. You know, how do you initiate contact with somebody? You know, how do you approach somebody? How do you be a good friend? Sometimes those directive techniques will help, especially with, I think, smaller children. And also remind them to share about themselves. They're interesting. Young people are very interesting, and sometimes they don't know that about themselves. So in a way, you need to give them that audience where you can reflect back to them, like, wow, that's really interesting about you. Like, and that's how they start to form their self-concept and sense of themselves. You know, you want to help them to increase their self-awareness, and you also want to be a positive role model for them. So what I mean by that is not that you need to be perfect. You are not, I am not, none of us are, and your kids are not also. But I think what you can model for them is how you make your best effort to be kind to others, how you negotiate conflicts, how you navigate those kinds of you know, stressful situations. And I think, you know, even if you don't hit the mark there, you can say, gosh, you know, if I had to do it over again, I think this is what I would say. And so let your kids, maybe let them see your process for working through these things, because they're internalizing it. And, you know, your actions and words matter. Finally, I want to say, don't tolerate unkind behavior. I think in that situation, it's important to be direct with them, but make sure that you don't shame them or be critical as you're describing to them, you know, what they did wrong, right? So watch your tone. The important thing is for it to be a teaching moment. And so again, you don't want them to get defensive. You want them to be receptive and to understand, oh, okay, this is what I did, and this is the impact it had on someone else. And maybe I should try something different. I believe the last point I have really is to foster secure attachment. And kids, they develop certain attachment styles when they're young. And somebody who develops a secure attachment style develops social competence, right? Because they feel trust in their relationships, like in their family relationships. So they can carry that out, in the world when they make social relationships. Also, their expectations are higher of what relationships should look like. So I think, fostering a secure attachment is important. And then one more thing I just would add is, as you're watching this presentation, some of you might be saying, okay, in this respect, I've done a really good job, but maybe in these other respects, I could stand to improve. So I hope that you're kind to yourself and that you give yourself a break, because you've done the best you could, and just move forward, right? I think we all can be kinder to ourselves. So I would say choose kindness. It is a choice. And I think the world could definitely stand, to be a kinder place. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Stacy.
Thank you so much, Michelle. We've had a bunch of great questions sent in, but we just want to get through the last couple slides. And then I'm going to stop the recording and we'll get to a bunch of our questions. So as you join us today, we do want to encourage you to join CTY. You would do that at our start page. If you have any questions about CTY, please reach out to our enrollment center either by email or by phone.
Mm-hmm.
Next slide, Michelle.
Sure.
And as we conclude, I just want to leave up our thank you slide that lists for you there some of our social media links. I do want to point out that not only do we have a public Facebook page, but we also have a moderated Facebook parents group that I encourage everyone to join, because discussions just like the one we're having here today are very commonly taking place on our parents' Facebook group.